I'd like now to move and introduce our two distinguished speakers who will be joining us and making a special presentation on today's webinar. So today's webinar, as I said, is really demystifying the transformative agenda. Why is this relevant for me? And we have two speakers. The first speaker is Patricia McIlreavy. Patricia is a senior director at the Humanitarian Policy for InterAction, based in Washington, D.C., in the United States. As you know, InterAction is a U.S.-based relief and development organization. And Patricia is responsible for ensuring an effective representation of the U.S.-based NGOs in the international humanitarian policy discussions, including at the ISC forum. Patricia's experience in the humanitarian field goes back to 1993 when she joined USAID, and after serving initially with the USAID team to Rwanda in '94, Patricia took a number of field positions with the International Rescue Committee in Rwanda, but also for a number of 14 years. She was also the country director in Sudan, in Tanzania, in Burundi, and as the regional director for the Horn and East Africa. In this position as a regional director, she covered a number of countries, including Chad, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Directly before starting her work in InterAction, Patricia was working based in Amman, Jordan, where she worked for 3 years as an international management and training consultant with a number of diverse organizations, including NGOs, Red Cross, and United Nations and NATO. Patricia holds a master's degree in international affairs from the American University School for International Service, and she's currently a fellow at the MIT Seminar 21 program. In 2014, she was also selected for inclusion into the United Nations Humanitarian Coordination Pool, and she's also a member of the STAIT, which is the TA support program, part of the interagency group. Our second speaker is Gwyn Lewis. Gwyn, she's the chief of the Global Cluster Coordination Section in UNICEF's Emergency Division. She joined UNICEF from FAO in 2012, where she worked as a humanitarian policy officer. Before that, Gwyn worked with OCHA in Geneva, focusing mainly on the global humanitarian platform and partnership issues, but also with reform in a more general sense. Previously to that, Gwyn worked with OCHA and the International Committee of the Red Cross in the OP team. She has also worked with UNMIC in Kosovo and in various positions with NGOs in Tajikistan, in Afghanistan, and Albania. I would like to say a warm welcome to our speakers, and of course a warm welcome to all of you. I can see the number of attendees is going by the minute. We feel very encouraged to see such a high participation, given the fact that this is actually the second time we're making the same presentation today, and I can see a huge interest, and many of you calling from different parts of the world. I can see from Africa, the Middle East, North America, which is very encouraging, and we take it as a sign that really many of you want to hear, want to understand, indeed want to hear the demystification of the transformative agenda and find out more about the relevance of all this reform. So I would like to start actually with a question first to Patty. Patty, we hear a lot the term TA, or transformative agenda, and to be honest, most people's eyes roll when we say the word or TA. Very few humanitarians really understand what it's all about. Is this the same like the humanitarian reform under a new name? Can you give us a better understanding about really the purpose of the TA, where it's coming from, and really better explain what it's all about? Patty, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. Yeah, I'll do my best to do that. I think the TA, what it is it's not the same as the original reform, which was in 2005, but it stems from the same place, which is about us trying to improve how we work and doing so in an interagency fashion for the benefit of the beneficiaries and the populations we're serving. So in many ways, it echoes it. It's also along the lines of leadership and funding and coordination, But it goes beyond the predictability. In 2005, what we kind of put out there was about predictable leadership, kind of knowing what was happening. But now it's taking it to that next step. The transformative agenda is about, well, okay, now we know what's supposed to happen, but, you know, is it happening as well as it can do? Is it, you know, where there's some tweaks, some misinformation or some misunderstandings that need to be addressed? One of those, for example, a misunderstanding was that the original reform was a UN reform. It wasn't. At the original reform, it was also an interagency standing committee reform. You see the logos of the organizations up on the website. While it is, of course, there are quite a number of UN actors in it, it also includes 3 international NGO consortia, the Red Cross Red Crescent Movement, and IOM. And so we do have, you know, an interagency body that is trying to define how we work together in emergencies and in crises for the good of people. And so while we wanted to look at how do we improve, how do we simplify some of the language that we use, where were there misunderstandings. So I think you can think of the transformative agenda, while it is a body of documents, it is a tweaking. It is looking at what have we learned over the past few years in terms of working better together, and how much further can we go? Where are we at this stage to go a bit further, to take that next step in improving? And it's beyond the systems. You know, the initial reform was really like, let's lay out the systems that can help us improve. And now let's try and examine the processes. What are the ways of working together? What are the attitudes? What's the collective? What can the collective do to work together better? I mean, I remember during the early days of the Transformative Agenda discussions, before it was even called the Transformative Agenda, where one of the members around the room from one of the UN agencies said, oh, so this is really about being individually accountable for the collective response. And that was kind of a moment where everyone was like, yeah, that's actually what we're talking about. It seems such a simple thing, but it's actually very hard. It's individual person, you know, self, but it's also individual organization, agency, mandates, a lot of issues that come within that. So how do you frame the individual responsibility and accountability to a collective? And that's a bit, you know, what the purpose was, and I think what we're still striving to get towards.
Thanks, Patty. Actually, we hear you not very well, Patty, so if you could come a little bit closer to the microphone, or if there is any way to improve the quality of it. But in the meantime, I'd like to move to my second question to Gwyn and also to you, Patty. We're really talking about the transformative agenda. We understand that issues such as leadership, coordination, accountability are the 3 core issues when looking at the transformative agenda. So can you tell us why were these chosen? What is it really, how did the interagency come to these 3 pillars, and why are they really so important in terms of the transformative agenda? Over to you, Gwyn.
Thanks, Panos. The discussions in terms of defining the transformative agenda really stemmed from a whole process of thinking about how we could do better, but not only how we could do better, but how we can make sure that we're doing better. And accountability was really the starting point of those discussions, because it really looked at how we can make sure that we're accountable to affected populations, which is really the fundamental aim of the transformative agenda, but also how we make sure that we're accountable within the systems and the structures and the architecture that we have in place in countries. So there's two aspects, so maybe to just go into them in a little bit more detail. The first, in terms of accountability within the humanitarian system, is really about how can we make sure that the humanitarian country team in an emergency context is accountable for the overall response. That means how can we make sure that this priority is given to the needs of the most vulnerable and to the affected population within the various programs, but the response plan more generally, and that we're not focusing on agency mandates. It means how we link various groups together, how the cluster coordinators that are responsible for defining with the partners the strategic objectives of their sectors link to the broader accountabilities of the HCT and the broader strategic objectives in country. The accountability also touches on leadership, obviously. It really is giving the space to the humanitarian country team to make decisions, and giving authority to the humanitarian coordinator to make tough decisions when consensus cannot be reached in the humanitarian country team. More fundamentally, though, is really accountability to affected populations. Ultimately, we need to really ensure that we've consulted, that we've heard, that we've listened, and that we've acted on the feedback from men, women, boys, girls, and other vulnerable groups, such as the disabled, people affected by violence in all aspects of the program cycle. So it's about making sure we're consulting with everyone during the assessment phase, that when we've designed our response that people are comfortable with it, and that we're monitoring and taking into account and feeding the views of the affected populations back into our programming. So for me, that's really where the discussions in terms of where the discussion on the transformative agenda came from, and how we've developed these pillars. Over to you, Panos.
I'd like actually to bring Patty also to this conversation. Patty, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Panos, I'm hoping the sound is better now. I just wanted to touch on coordination, and that was related to, we have the predictability of the clusters, and that, that's known and that's accepted, and that's very useful. But each cluster was being managed in a different way. Each cluster was, within the countries, the different clusters were managing differently, and then between countries, even a similar cluster like water and sanitation would be managed differently. There wasn't a clear enough guidance out there. It was felt there was some, development of things by the different clusters, but even those weren't connected. So one of the things that happened within the transformative agenda was to really explore: is there guidance, simple, clear, unambiguous guidance on coordination that we can provide that goes across the clusters and across countries and helps to frame it so that different individuals, so that one individual who maybe attends several different meetings, different clusters, isn't constantly having to be out of step with, well, wait, how does it work this in a certain way in this cluster or a different way in this cluster? And so what came out of that was what's called the Cluster Coordination Reference Module, and in that was very clearly laid out, and it is being practiced, and you can see it in certain places. How do we do intercluster coordination? How do we share leadership, both, between, for example, NGOs and the UN, if there's a need for that, but also at a sub-cluster level in country. What is the expectations? What are my expectations of the cluster coordinator as my guide for the cluster? But also, what are the expectations of the other members, participants within that cluster? And lastly, and there's other things, but another piece that I think is very important to note, because it was really missing, was when do you stand down a cluster? Why do you need it? When is it needed? It's really about coordination. It's not about sectoral importance, and kind of really clarifying that. It's about when there's a need for coordination. And when that coordination need is no longer required, for example, if the government has really got a very vibrant, strong coordination sectoral body, how do you stand it down? What do you do to move away from having this structure that might be a parallel to another? And these are things that came out of the Transformative Agenda that are now written out as instructions and are utilized by the different global cluster coordinators in their guidance to cluster leads at country level, but also as guidance to the NGO community, who both participate as members, but also at times lead or co-lead clusters.
Gwyn and Patty, you talked about accountability to affected people, putting the affected people in the very square of the response, in the center of our hearts, of our minds, of everything we're trying to do to better reach them, to better help them. You've also talked about leadership. You've talked about coordination fit for purpose, making sure that the coordination is really a means to ensure better delivery, but certainly not an end result on its own. So that's all very good, and we've heard a lot about the TA protocols. Now, I've heard many colleagues in the field say that, we now have a bunch of documents, baby. We have all these papers called the protocols, which are described as the tools to the transformative agenda. So from your kind of practical field experience, I would like to ask you, what do you see as kind of the top 3 changes that you expect to see or you have seen as a result of the transformative agenda, looking at it from a field perspective? And if you could please give us some specific examples. So I'm going to hand over back to Patty.
Hi, Panos, you dropped off there, but I think you were handing over to me. I wanted to touch first on the question of the document. And that is, is this just a bunch of documents? I mean, to make the transformative agenda real, we had to write something. Attitude change doesn't come from wishful thinking or vague instructions. Not a bureaucracy of coordination, and that's what we have. I mean, we are, $17 billion, through the different NGOs and organizations and UN agencies that work in these responses, and that money, you need guidance on how we're going to work together, and that's why we wrote things down. So there could be some clarity between countries, between organizations. What is a real expectation? Do I think everyone needs to read every aspect of the transformative agenda to feel its benefits? I don't believe so. I think that there are going to be parts of it that touch on you more within your own area of work than others. And so to give a few examples of that, what does that look like? Well, for me, there's my three top things would be that NGOs were truly engaged in decision making. What does this mean in practice? Well, and we have seen it in some countries where humanitarian country teams have vibrant engagement from the NGO community, such as in Yemen. We see, a large number of organizations are part of that humanitarian country team, and they do have discussions on priority issues. And by that we mean, what sectors are critical, what needs are we addressing, what is the approach we're taking, what locations are going to be prioritized for access and funding, what is some of the messaging we can have on that. There are other examples of that. I mean, unfortunately, as this is still in process, we also have examples of where that maybe isn't as vibrant as it needs to be. But I think we need to, the roadmap is there now, and we need to look at how do we follow that path together. The second thing I would like to see is really active participation in collective planning within the various stages of the humanitarian program cycle. And again, what does that mean in practice? It means needs assessments are truly interagency. The analysis of that assessment is occurring from a group of individuals who work for different organizations together to try and define what are the actual needs. And again, we have seen these occurring in certain countries. And are they perfect everywhere? No, but Syria just went through one of these, for example, as mentioned, needs overview, and they're working on it together and getting there. And that includes as well intercluster engagement, so that it's not, again, a siloed approach of different organizations and different sectoral interests, but actually what are the overarching needs and how does everyone contribute to it. And lastly, I would say, and this is a general comment, this is really about more transparency and trust in how we partner. For the first two things to happen, we actually need this last. And so maybe, this is kind of my primary one, was how do we actually begin to really understand and respect each other's roles, what we bring to the table, and what we can take away from a decision that's been made together. And that we need to get there. And I think the TA starts to put out the framing for that, for a common rules of the game, a common understanding towards an attitude change that will get us to a place where we're working better together.
Maybe I can come in to add to what Patty's just said. I mean, for the protocols are important guidelines, and they help provide some tools to be able to work together. But what they also do is provide enough space for each country to adapt them. They're not a script that each country needs to follow. The humanitarian response in country needs to build what already exists in a particular country and needs to be adapted to each context. Every country and every region within every country has a very specific need and way of working, and we need to be flexible and adapt that and adapt how we're working in order to be best able to respond to needs. One example maybe we can give is that each humanitarian country team is now being asked to develop a calendar for their planning, so they decide when it's most relevant for the context to do a needs assessment or a needs overview, when the strategic planning should happen, and those decisions are based on the situation in country, the political context, whether or not the agricultural planning cycles are the most relevant for development of an SRP. The other thing I think the humanitarian program cycle under the transformative agenda attempts to do is really to cut down on process. We still duplicate a lot in terms of how we monitor and report. In one country, for example, I recently heard that there was more than 20 information management products and advocacy products, and each of those requires information from different organizations and different clusters in country. So we need to streamline processes, make sure that to the extent possible we're selecting indicators for the clusters that can also be used by different organizations for their own programming and for reporting to donors. So we're cutting down on process and streamlining, and that we're working together as clusters to support the overall strategic objectives that are set by the humanitarian country team. We need to be more focused and we need to prioritize around those strategic objectives. And I'd like to echo what Patty has said, that we really need to build trust within the system. The needs are enormous and are growing. I mean, and funding is still limited. Each organization has a part to play in addressing needs, and there's a huge level of complementarity in the humanitarian system. But until we build reliance and trust, we can't move beyond competition for resources, and that's really the linchpin in terms of how we move forward under the TA. Thanks, Panos.
Thanks to both of you. Patty, you talked about this attitude change, this mindset change, this way that we need to think in a way, looking a lot more of the collective while we all bring in for our strengths on what we're trying to do around the table and how to build this transparency and trust with all the partners. But also, Gwyn, you brought this simplification, basically, which is about making life easier and not making it more complicated. Now, I want to ask you, go back, Gwyn, to what you were saying, and I want to ask you about these protocols or these tools that have been put together and out there. I don't even know how many people may have read them or even are aware of that. But do these protocols tell us everything we need to know about the TA? Does it mean that, like, colleagues who are listening need to take them and kind of apply them? What would you say is not in the protocols, or what should colleagues who are listening us? And I want to say that at this moment, from what I can see in front of me on the screen, we really have a wide number of colleagues who are joining us, basically from North America to all over Africa and the Middle East. So I'm very encouraged by the participation we have on this webinar. So, Gwyn, over to you.
Hello.
Gwyn, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I've just asked a question about the protocols, if they tell us everything we need to know about the transformative agenda, or is there anything else which is not inside the protocols? Over to you.
Thanks, Panos. You dropped for a second, but yeah, no, I mean, the protocols don't answer every question, and they're not meant to, and they're meant to be used as a guide. So they don't elicit an overall need for culture change across the humanitarian sector, but really that's what we're asking. We're asking for people to really think about what they're doing, putting people at the center of our response and really thinking about our collective responsibilities. We need to be able to put our agency interests aside to ensure the best response, and that's really what the TA in broad terms is asking us to do. And this is a process that will take time. It's not enough to come with new guidance or a better strategic response planning guidance. That's not going to create the change we need. We need every person and every organization within an emergency to really take this on board and slowly begin to push and ask for better complementarity, better partnership. But what the protocols I think help us to do as well is really hold our leadership to account. And by leadership I mean everything from cluster coordinators to members of the HCT, that they're asked to work in this way and that they take into account their collective responses, the collective response overall. So they don't answer everything, but I think they're a very good starting point. And they do give us the flexibility to be able to adapt our response while at the same time ensuring that we make efforts to work better and to do better at being accountable to affected populations. Thanks, Panos.
Thanks, Gwyn. Actually would like to move back to Patty. Patty, actually both of you and Gwyn talked about the need to have a better response with better outcomes for people. Really, it's about better efficiency, in particular around people who have been affected by disaster. So practically, let's say if I'm a program officer or if I'm a cluster coordinator in one or the other clusters, what can I do differently to help bring these transformative agenda changes to life? Can you give us a few examples? Over to you.
Well, I mean, it's kind of this is one of these challenging ones where it's a little bit about giving change a chance. And we come to every crisis with, you know, our what happened in the last, and in terms of the relationships and our expectations of each other. I think we all at times need to take a step back and say, okay, we're going to try and do something a little differently. We're going to try and change attitudes. We're going to look at different processes and different products and how we get there. And I think it's about, okay, taking a deep breath and saying, I'm going to try again. I'm going to, you know, this time we're going to be part of the change that we want to see happen in maintaining our focus on the beneficiaries and the affected populations and knowing, because we all know deep down that working together is the better way to serve these populations. No one can do it all. So I think, you know, one is that framing, is how do we keep that in mind and have that patience with each other to get there, because some of us will get there much faster than others. And some of us will have the space to get there faster than others. And as we all know, you'll meet individuals who themselves are ready, but their organization maybe isn't yet. But in terms of the individual, I think, you know, one, it's taking the time to participate in the collective, to look at, you know, if I engage in the cluster, how do I ensure that I'm not passive, but how do I also push that the cluster not be passive itself? If I'm not getting what I need or want out of the cluster, how do I push to make sure that it becomes what I want it to be, what I need it to be, that it serves my purpose? Well, what's in it for me? And the cluster coordinator is the same. You know, what they need to make sure that everyone, that they're constantly looking at, this isn't just about what they need, but what everyone in the, you know, all their stakeholders need to make it successful. We need to not be distracted by egos and competition, but rather look at, you know, the opportunities our diversity brings, and you know, how is that going to improve the quality of our work. For this, I think we may need to sometimes, you know what we know, and know what we don't know, and look at how do we find out from each other. You know, we all sectoral approaches. We need to move beyond our silos, and that's where the intercluster approach becomes important. So that's another aspect of it. It's not just within the cluster itself, looking at how do we improve, but looking as well as how do we improve outside of that. How do we build our relationships outside of our traditional comfort zone? And look at, okay, I'm going to release a little bit of space because I know that for this response to work better, I need to have other actors in it with me, and not other actors in my sector, but other actors who work in different sectors with whom maybe I have not the same relationship as those I'm more familiar with. And that's also a part of it, is making that space available for others to come in and help me and work with us. So those would be some areas, I think, and we need to work, and I think we've seen, you know, for example, in Central African Republic, while it wasn't yet working fully on our trip there, we did see that, you know, the intercluster group was stood up. They were looking at how to try and address issues like relocation, which is not resolved by any one sector or cluster itself. It requires everyone to work together. And while they weren't there yet, you know, they at least had begun the conversation, and that's what is important in terms of getting those conversations and hopefully continuing to press at them until the solution is found.
Thanks, Patty. And I'd really like to thank all of you who are already sending us questions through the chat line or directly to us. And I'd like to encourage all of you who hasn't done so, please feel free to go ahead and send us your questions live. We'll try to answer as many as possible as we go through until the end of this program. Please be bold, frank, open, direct. That's the whole point of this discussion, to be able really to exchange among ourselves, share best practices, but also to be able to call a spade and see how to correct, improve, change, bring change and a different attitude and mindset. A number of you have asked questions related to the coordination. So one of you is saying, how can we streamline further the cluster structures, which here in our country have gone a little bit overboard? There's an example about Mali where there's 8 task force and or subclusters taking place at the same time. A related question to the cluster, and I'd like to package them together, is about the co-leadership of the clusters, this UN, NGO, INGO balance, which is vital, is absolutely vital in everything we do. And really, you will even see in this program, we always try to make sure that we have a UN and INGO participant. It's about joining hands, about working together, about bringing a better way. So I'd like to actually ask Gwyn if you could please take over the questions on coordination, co-leadership, looking at streamlining the size, the structure, fit-for-purpose coordination between the clusters. Gwyn, over to you.
Thanks, Panos. I think these are excellent questions. These are something that the global clusters have tried to articulate and provide answers to in the new cluster coordination reference module that Patty mentioned earlier. What the cluster coordination reference modules aim to do is really to focus on the core functions of the clusters. What we found in many situations is that the clusters were asked to do everything, be everything to everyone, and expectations were very high, and there was very often a frustration when the coordinators and the coordination teams were not able to address all that was asked. So we've narrowed down the core functions of the cluster, and the 5 or 6 core functions now really provide the core for each cluster at country level. Having said that, we do still have, in some places, clusters that attempt to address many different issues, and there is issues like in Mali. I'm not aware of it, but that where we have subclusters and maybe too many meetings, which makes it very, very challenging for smaller organizations in particular to attend all of the meetings. One of the ways we've suggested in the modules to address this is really to. The first aspect is really that all partners within a cluster have a role to play. If there's a feeling or a sense that a cluster is getting too big and taking over, or it's not reasonable to have 8 groups, it really is the responsibility of the partners within the cluster to raise this. And within we talk about minimum commitments of cluster partners to really engage and not just show up and share information, but really shape the cluster to what they feel is needed in country. So that's one way of answering the question, but it really needs to be adapted to a country context, and that's something that we've really emphasized. In terms of the co-leadership, that's something also that's in the reference modules and something that we encourage, particularly in large-scale emergencies where it's very challenging to deal with all of the issues that need to be addressed, from needs assessment to strategic planning to monitoring. That co-leadership of 2 organizations in addition is very, very helpful. We have some very good examples of where that has worked well. But like we mentioned before, the behavior and culture change takes time, and though we are working with our representatives and the heads of the cluster lead agency to promote this, sometimes it's challenging to really make those changes, and so there's more efforts to document where it has worked well. But ultimately, I think the principle that we're trying to promote, it's the organization that's best placed, that has the best operational presence and the resources to support the leadership of a cluster that should be working on the cluster. And that's why we also are encouraging flexibility if at a sub-regional level. It makes more sense to have a health and nutrition cluster rather than 2 separate clusters, or to merge certain sectors because it's more appropriate for the response. We also encourage that. So again, bringing it back to the context on what architecture is needed to best respond, and not the other way around. Thanks, Panos.
Thanks, Gwyn. So basically what you're telling colleagues is that they have the free hand to go at their own structure, the ACT, the intercluster, the cluster level, review the coordination and architecture, and make some recommendations for adjustment if it's too many meetings, if it's too big or too complex, it doesn't fit to the current situation, then to find specific solutions on the ground in terms of how to simplify solutions that are not based around raising an agency flag, but solutions that really center around how to best help the people and how to make the response lighter, more efficient in order to bring better results. There is also another question which is related to this from one of the listeners who is saying, more and more emergency scenarios are contextualized in overlapping refugees, IDPs, migrants, complex emergencies which involve various groups that define themselves in need of humanitarian assistance. Do we need different coordination mechanisms relevant for each group, as it all happens today? How to avoid confusion, overlapping, competition, and most importantly, how to increase accountability to the people in need? How can the TA be the universal approach, applicable and acceptable to everybody? So I'd like to pass on this question to Pat. Over to you.
Thanks, Panos. I'm glad to see the participants are challenging us with some good questions, and ones we actually ourselves are constantly, challenging and asking of the wider policy bodies that discuss these things. I mean, I'd love to say that there was a solution, that there was an agreement that we would have one universal approach. And, I personally, in the interest of transparency and building trust, I personally believe we should have one universal approach. But I think what happens is it gets very confused by context, by mandates of organizations. I mean, there are, for example, refugees are, that's the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and it's not easy for the UNHCR to step away from that and say we entrust the rest of the system to help us with carrying out our mandate, and that's a heavy ask of them. Can we make inroads though over time? I do think we can. I think we can work together to explore and explain that an approach doesn't have to be a threat to a mandate. That if we can entrust the predictability of the approach, if we can look at how it actually makes us more effective and it makes us makes funding go further, that I think will help us get there over time. But I also think we need to recognize the role that donors play in that. So it's not just merely an individual organization or agency sticking to a mandate and a focus and being not willing to be a manager of change. I think it's also that we have donors who have different funding streams, who want to assist different contexts and different populations, and that as well then complicates and muddies the waters of a clarity and approach. For example, if you have a population, we have the same thing with natural disasters, with conflict. We have different donors, we have different funding mechanism streams for preparedness. All of these things, reinforce this thing we're actually trying to change. They reinforce this siloing. They reinforce the idea that change, that the populations face different types of needs at different times, versus a lot of these happening concurrently and requiring us to look at them as a whole. So that's the crux of the accountability to affected people. I mean, how do we actually be accountable to affected people when in some ways our system itself is not entirely as nimble as it should be to actually be accountable, especially on a collective level. So that is, one of the struggles we have. The main message I would leave you with is, we're not giving up the fight on that. We are still dialoguing and discussing it and debating it openly in the policy, in the operational discussions that we have. Has the response been hindered by this? What can we do to improve? What are some of the things that can happen? And for example, we saw some changes come to Jordan as a result of some of these conversations. There was more relaxation of the ownership by one agency and looking at how do I share out some of this leadership. So I think we're getting there, but it's going to take us some time, and it's going to, again, these are big changes we're asking on an individual and especially on an organizational level. And I think we are, we've got the ideas on paper. We've got, some very high-level advocates for it. We just need to now start to percolate and get it to where it needs to be. On the accountability to affected populations, if I may just take a minute to touch on that, I think we definitely need some work on that in an individual organizational level, and especially for those who are closest to the affected populations, for example, the NGOs. I think we've made some progress. I think we need to be careful not to rest on our laurels. We have a ways to go. But we've made some progress with complaints mechanisms, but it's very, and with being accountable to them in the design and the actual implementation. But it's still a bit, further away than it should be in reality. And then comes the more complex collective accountability. How do we be collective together? And that just feeds into fears of change, because suddenly, what is the reporting mechanism of one organization about another, and what does that mean? And there's been some challenges within that, but I think the commitment to accountability to affected populations is a starting point. It provides us with a foundation, a very solid foundation, and we need to now build on that. We need some strong examples of where it's worked. We need to stop looking for, reaching for the perfect, and really start looking at some of the good enough in our collective accountability. And that doesn't mean we don't strive for the perfect, but I think sometimes we're paralyzed by our pursuit of the perfect, and so we have people saying, well, we can't do that, and we can't do it as well as we should, so we shouldn't do anything. And that's the wrong answer. And we need some more scaling up of some of the places where it's worked in a small way, and look at learning from that, and how do we bring it to a broader base. And that's one of the things on the collective AAP that I think we're starting to slowly find some resonance in, especially in the larger crises.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks for taking the accountability to affected people question as well. And indeed, we have received a number of questions of colleagues who are asking really about the accountability to affected people. And I have to say, as a TA support team, since the beginning of the year, we have now taken a number of missions, primarily on the L3 countries in Philippines, Central African Republic, in South Sudan, but also a number of TA support missions to other countries. Actually, we've just returned from Yemen. And most HCTs, most humanitarian actors, struggle about how to implement this principle of accountability to affected people. While there is a 100% buy-in commitment of everybody to do everything possible, in practice, how to bring to an HCT feedback from the communities in order to adjust, to fine-tune the response in the best possible way. And here in discussions with the HCT, with the AAP working group, I understand there is a practical guidelines that is in the making, and I hope that it will go out fairly soon in order to have some common indicators to measure, so that it not only is done by the individual NGOs or UN agencies, but all of this is brought together to the collective planning, to the humanitarian response plan, in order to better guide and adjust the response as it evolves on the ground. Now, we have a question of one of the callers who is saying, the transformative agenda, is this only applied for the L3s? What difference does it make for the rest of the operations around the world? So, Patty or Gwyn, who would like to take this question?
I can come in on that. The protocols initially and the TA, the thinking was really around the large-scale emergencies, so the L3s, and the transformative agendas discussions were initiated after the earthquake in Haiti and the floods in Pakistan. So very much at the top of everyone's minds was the L3s. But as the discussions move forward and given as well what we tried to do for the L3s was simplify and clarify and focus, so that it was more feasible to implement some of the guidelines. We felt it was very relevant for other emergencies, and subsequently work was done to amend the protocols so that they were relevant not only to L3s but other types of emergencies. And the principles that we're talking about collective results, about accountability, about building trust and strengthening partnership are fundamental to any emergency response. There's no context that I know of where we have enough resources to do everything that we need to do, regardless of the scale of the emergency. So working together better, being more effective, being more strategic in how we're thinking about the response applies to all. And that was also why, again, the guidelines, the protocols are guidelines. And so not everything will necessarily be used in all contexts, and it's really taking those principles and looking at them and adapting them to the context, whether that's the type of cluster you have, whether that's the type of leadership, whether that's, and that's about how you prioritize your response. So it's really, again, about not only L3s and thinking better how we do that, which is very, very important, but really how we're working together as a system overall. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Gwyn. We've got another listener who's actually sent us a question, and he's asking, or she's asking, where is the role of the donors in the transformative agenda? What is their point of view? Are they also reforming to be able to better adjust? And the second part of the question is about the role of the governments, host governments, whether on a natural disaster or on the conflict situation. So, Patty, would you like to take the first part of this question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Panos. I mean, the role of the donors is interesting. I'm glad that question came out. The donors have been involved. They've been involved with, following and engaging on the transformative agenda from its earliest days. Have they yet started to change? I think they have in some level. They have begun to explore what this may mean in terms of how they change. The good humanitarian donorship, is one of the things that they're looking, GHD, they're looking at utilizing that this year a bit to see, how the symmetry is between the transformative agenda and some of the discussions or goals of it, and how they themselves can further reinforce it. And to just say, I mean, I want to be more clear, it's not just that they're following it, in some type of way from their headquarters. Actually, every 6 months, they're meeting with the Interagency Standing Committee, the emergency directors, which includes, again, the operational directors of some of the NGOs, and basically asking what's going on, how is this being pursued. InterAction, for my organization, we've done several surveys and different discussion points with NGOs on the ground from the field and fed that back to the donors. So they are getting direct reinforcement of what's occurring. It's not just that the protocols alone stand by themselves and are these papers good. You have the same coming from the UN agencies in terms of evaluating and examining how it's impacting and how it's being understood by people on the ground. And you have the operational peer reviews and the work of the senior TA implementation team through their visits, all of which are constantly looking at and exploring and examining, is this working? I mean, it's one difference from the original reform in 2005, and I think this current transformative agenda is we aren't stepping back and letting it sit and hoping that it works. We're constantly looking at how do we further make sure that this is actually understood and is working, and what do we need to do to help people understand what to expect out of this in the future and how to ask for it.
Thanks, Patty. Gwyn, would you like to come in with the second part of the question about the role of host governments in the transformative agenda, both in a natural disaster or in a conflict situation? Over to you.
The role of the host government is very important. We've really tried to highlight the importance, again, coming back to a point made earlier, of building on what exists in country, and that includes government. If government structures are strong, we don't come in and take over, particularly in a natural disaster situation like the Philippines with a very strong government. But given the scale of the disaster, the government needed support to respond. So our role there is really to come in as a humanitarian community and help that response. So in the Philippines, the role of the government was is in terms of leadership and really leading the overall response. There's nuances to that, obviously, because in some situation when the government is party to the conflict, that becomes more challenging, and then we have to nuance how we work together in order to support those affected by the crisis. So there's variations and different ways of organizing our support in order to be able to better respond. So I mean, those nuances and the complexity that conflict or certain situations or certain contexts bring obviously need to be taken into account, but they do need to be taken into account. We don't work in a parallel way to national authorities, but we advocate and we promote humanitarian principles and principles of neutrality. So not a very easy question to answer, a very important one, but really it's thinking through how best to respond, and again putting people at the center of the response. Thanks.
Thanks, Gwyn. We have one more question, which is really about partnership. And the sender has sent a question, one of our colleagues who sent us a question saying, one aspect of the humanitarian reform that doesn't seem to be highlighted enough in the transformative agenda is partnership. Can you comment on that? Patty, can I ask you to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, partnership, I mean, we explored this when we were looking at the transformative agenda. Do we need to write something beyond the principle of partnership? Do we need to examine, further that it was well recognized within the original 2005 reform that partnership was left out, and I think, by accident, but, self is telling that it was left out. It did come back in the global humanitarian platform on which Gwyn worked, addressed this and looked at how do we bring the principles of partnership forward and make it more real. The TA, to be honest, when we were looking at it, we felt that the principles were already, they're there. They're not implemented. It's not that we need to tweak them or we need to address them or change them. We need to actually follow them. We need to believe in them and make it not just a jargon that we're partners, and partners means somehow we're in the same place at the same time, but true partners, in that we actually work together and trust each other and communicate well. And interestingly enough, during the whole time when the Transformative Agenda first started to develop, we saw a reinvigoration of partnership discussions between the non-governmental organization community and some of the big UN operational agencies. Specifically, UNHCR held their structured dialogue with NGOs, and this wasn't about implementing partners. This was with NGOs. How do we complement each other as experts? How do we look at how do we work together better in the field, share information, advocacy messaging? UNICEF had a global consultation, and even WFP, began exploring again how do we have this really vibrant dialogue with the NGO community. So we did see a reinvigoration, a reattention made to NGOs, not just as implementers, but actually as experts and colleagues in the field. I think we need to continue to work on it. We say it's the foundation of all reforms. A foundation implies that it's solid, that we know that it's there and that it can be built upon. I actually think it's more of something that we're still building. Partnership is a constant process for anyone who's in a relationship of any sort. You know that it's not one day and it never changes. It constantly develops and evolves, and we need to be flexible to it. And so we need to, not navel gaze on it, but we need to not lose attention of it, that it requires work, and it requires us to maintain a commitment to it and to understand the principles and to try our best to follow them.
Thank you. We have two last questions which we would like to cover in the couple of minutes that are left. And I can see that Adam from Somalia has sent us two questions. The first one he's asking is about the NGOs and basically saying, do the NGOs have to develop their own transformative agendas separately, or is it up for the humanitarian coordination to work with the clusters in the country in order to develop a consolidated transformative agenda to encourage better response to a disaster or to an emergency? So it's really about the NGOs being part of the humanitarian response and how can they influence to bring this change. And then I'm going to take the second question at the same time because we're running out of time, which is really about this interrelation between the three pillars of the transformative agenda: leadership, coordination, accountability. How does this work all together in a response in a disaster situation? So I'd like to ask perhaps Patty and Gwyn to take each of these questions. Over to you.
I'll go with the first one. I mean, the simple answer is no. The NGOs shouldn't be developing their own. The humanitarian coordinator is to guide the interagency coordination. They are to help guide, listen to everyone, to learn from everyone, to ensure that the clusters are managed together and feed up, that they have a humanitarian country team that is actually representative of the diversity, and that humanitarian country team is where key decisions are made, fed into from key decisions made at the clusters. And so we have numerous levels of where partners, UN and NGOs and others are working together to determine priorities for their level, for their sector, feeding it up, further reinforcement of that, discussion, debate, dialogue, agreement, and that is all happening together. So on that one, I think we need to be looking at it as an overarching combined effort.
Thanks, Patty. Gwyn, very briefly, over to you on the second question.
Yes, thanks. I mean, the three pillars of the transformative agenda: coordination, leadership, and accountability, are very interrelated. And I think they are the three pillars because we need to have all three of them in order to have a strong response. You need strong leadership and coordination. You need the leadership within the HUT to coordinate well, and both have to be accountable to each other as well as to affected populations. So I think that the separation in some ways is very artificial, but I think the importance was to really demonstrate, to articulate what the three basic, the minimum that we need in order to ensure a strong response. I hope that answers the question. Thanks. Thanks, Panos.
Thanks, Gwyn. I also see Claudine asking us about looking at the complexity of the situation. Is basically on the one hand having the local government and the time that it takes, of course, to coordinate with them, at the same time managing the donors' expectation in an extreme and the flexibility that this takes on the ground. And just for the sake of time, I'm actually going to go myself on this one and say, really, obviously, bottom line is the response has to be a bottom-up approach, driven, guided by the operations, by the field. You should definitely engage the donors, share back your reflections on where you are, take their feedback on where it goes, but really the ultimate accountability lies within the humanitarian actors in terms of ensuring that what needs to be done has to be done in the right way. I'm afraid we're running out of time. I want to remind everybody to provide us feedback on the poll that has already appeared on your screen, and to give us some feedback on the webinar and this, how you have found it so far. Before closing, I would like to wrap up and say really that what I've heard Patty and Gwyn say earlier on is, bottom line, use your common sense. Look at your own context, look at the situation, both in terms of the coordination architecture, the response that needs to take place. The transformative agenda, the protocols are there to guide you, but this is not a container that you have to take and apply 100%. Take the tools from within that are relevant to your situation, and do not be afraid or hesitate to bring within the coordination structure that you have in place any suggestions for reform, for improvement that you see best fit in order to tailor-make the response, in order to bring this mind shift, this attitude shift, looking at the collective, looking at the people, putting at the center of the people what really needs to happen in terms of focus and also in terms of priorities, so that you can tell in the best possible way the story of what's happening there, to be able to bring more resources. We hope very much that you have found today's webinar useful, that you got some useful tips. I'd like to let you know that there is a series of more webinars coming up focusing on the transformative agenda. We have a webinar coming up on the centrality of protection, on better practical steps to apply the accountability to affected people, on HET effectiveness, on intercluster versus HET, and so on and so forth. So we will keep informing you about the webinars as they come along, and would appreciate also you giving us feedback in terms of what is going to be more useful for you from an operational, from a practical point of view, to put in place, to apply everything that is there. So first of all, I'd like to thank very much our two speakers today. Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Gwyn, for sharing your reflections, for sharing the best practices, and for participating to us today, and for answering to all the questions that we have received from all the participants from really all over the world. I'm amazed with the geographic disparity and the number of you who are at the end of the day or possibly in the middle of the day are joining us on this discussion. I would also like to thank all of you who have participated and who stayed from the very beginning of this webinar to this end 60 minutes later after we have started. I'd like to point, as you can see in front of you on the screen, that there is a website of the STAIT, the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Team, where there's a number of documents there, which we hope you'll find useful. Also at the ISC website, where there is a special page also set up looking at the transformative agenda. So this brings an end to this session. Again, thank you very much to everybody. And please, please, please don't forget to give us feedback on the poll, which really appears on your screen before you log away. Thank you and wish you all a pleasant day. Bye-bye.